judging the various projects that are going on. We welcome you here, and this is being broadcast across the universe on YouTube TV, which is why we're double mic'd. And we're here very much to share the enthusiasm about the combination of emergency medicine and our ability to practice into the future based on really, really good information, analysis, and practice support. So what we talk about here is beautiful data for wonderful, real people. And that's what emergency medicine is. Emergency medicine is not strings of data, and we want to make sure that everyone understands what comes to us and what goes back to them are two very different things. Very important streams of data occur, and you probably use them every day. And my favorite data is there are 4,000 sites that take mundane streams of data like temperature, wind direction, humidity, barometric pressure. And from that, we all decide that today it's too hot outside to be wearing sport coats and suits. That is a 160-year-old use of data streams. And with those data streams, very importantly, come information that helps people make their daily decisions. And in our case, those decisions impact lives. The Emergency Medicine Data Institute is built with 5 pillars. They're behind me. Those pillars are the ones really important to me in practice, to you in practice, to the patients we care for, the rest of the medical staff, the hospital, EMS, post-acute, and all of those pieces. So what we're going to do is kind of parse that apart here for you today. I get to serve as moderator, but turn this over to a very talented group sitting in front of you. Our next speaker is going to be Steve Epstein, who serves as the chair of the Board of Governors for the Emergency Medicine Data Institute. Really has been shepherding this through since 2010 and has provided the leadership we need to get 14 years later to the program we have today. Steve, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So how did we get here today? So 10 years ago, in this country, there was some legislation called NACRA. And what NACRA did was it replaced something called the Sustainable Growth Rate, which is really just how we're getting paid for healthcare in the United States. The Sustainable Growth Rate was a budget that the federal government had for how much they were going to pay for healthcare. And each year, we exceeded the budget. We go to Congress, say people are needing more care, and each year they would increase it. So the Sustainable Growth Rate was unsustainable, which is why we wound up with NACRA. And in proposing the NACRA legislation, they also proposed a new rubric for how we were going to pay for healthcare. In the past, we paid for healthcare on a fee-for-service basis. And for the most part, emergency medicine, even now, is paid for on a fee-for-service basis. You provide a service, you get a fee associated. But the change is to go to value, where we start to pay for the value of healthcare. Value being defined as the outcomes that we see. That can be better quality care, better access to care, better patient experience, divided by the inputs that we have to put in, costs. And it's not just the money, but it can be infrastructure. But usually that's just your cost basis. Yeah. So that's kind of how we're defining value. So in order to make this shift, the NACRA legislation said that we need to have doctors reporting their cost data and their quality data. Now, the cost data the federal government already has because you submit bills to Medicare and they can just look at those bills to determine how much it costs. But how good you're doing, well, that was a little harder. There have been projects before to report quality data. And part of this legislation was they were going to allow specialties to decide what data was actually meaningful, what quality measures matter, and if CMS agreed, it would allow you to report on those measures. Now, for a large emergency medicine group, a large academic center, they might have the wherewithal to get their computers all together and calculate this out. But for a smaller, even mid-sized emergency medicine group, a few docs, what have you, this would be an enormous task. So ACEP decided on behalf of the membership to create CEDAR. And CEDAR was designed to provide for it all of this reporting, primarily the quality reporting. So the CMS requirements are you have quality metrics that you have to report, the cost measures, which CMS calculates, two others, which we actually report one of those through CEDAR, which is the promoting interoperability, not promoting interoperability, it's the improvement activities. So you have to prove that you're doing something on the quality sphere to make your processes better. And we're actually exempt as emergency physicians from the promoting interoperability because that's really about your EHR. And we don't have control over our EHR. So instead, those points actually got put to the quality points. So quality became really important for us to do well with. So we've had this product, CEDAR, for a while. And what CEDAR did was it took an awful lot of data. We have raw data coming in from all sorts of different sources. We have EHR data, we have RCM data, we have the admit discharge transfer data. And we would take all of this data and we would make some of that data structured, and we would report that to the federal government. And that would be the quality data, the quality metrics that that you or a group might decide to report. And then they would give you a score and they would basically reimburse it for the next year based upon that score. But there was a lot of unstructured data that we had as well, because we actually had access in some cases to the whole clinical record. We built a connector to Epic. So we would get a lot of data, but we didn't spend the money to structure that because that really wasn't the purpose of CEDAR. CEDAR was just designed to report certain measures to the federal government. But we started thinking, well, what would happen if we actually could use that data? We could do all sorts of stuff. And that's the advent of the MPI. So now we take all of that additional data, we structure that data, so not only can we report your quality measures, but we're hoping we're going to be able to report a lot of other data. And using that data is now very valuable for research as well, all sorts of other purposes.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who can talk a little bit more about what we can do with all this data.
Thanks for that great overview of CEDAR and MACRA. So about, 2 years ago now, the ACEP Board of Directors decided to make a really big investment in the transformation of CEDAR to the Emergency Medicine Data Institute. What's the difference? So CEDAR still exists. It refers to the quality reporting function. So people can continue to use that for their mixed compliance and penalties and hopefully bonuses. And then Emergency Medicine Data Institute refers to the vast repository of data that has gone into CEDAR over the years. So we've retained, ACEP has retained everything since CEDAR's inception in 2015, when it was only a handful of sites. And since then, it's really grown rapidly, I think, to a peak of over 1,000 sites in 2019. And that year, there were 25 million encounters. And we continue to be around that. So, really broad swath of the country. We're talking, about 900 EDs, 15 and 25 million ED visits per year. And again, who are the people who are participating in this? On the whole, because of the incentives that Steve described, it is not your typical academic medical center in the Northeast. Most of these sites are, first of all, independent emergency physician groups, because that's the group that has to participate in this. And a lot of these are suburban and rural community shops. So the vast majority are under 20,000 visits per year. This is where most emergency care happens and where most Americans get their emergency care. And this is really interesting, right? Because most research happens at these large academic quaternary care centers, but that's not where most Americans get their care. And I do think that that's one of the real advantages of CEDAR is it offers a snapshot of, average emergency care in the U.S. And so it's really powerful in that sense that we've been able to aggregate these sites. And many of these sites, we have, repeated data over the years. So it's really grown to, at this point, almost 9 years of data for those very first sites. Obviously, fewer years for those that joined more recently. But there's a ton of potential, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what's actually in there. So really important to know, everything in CDER and EMDI comes from the electronic health record. So if you think about, what goes into an EHR, that's what we can get out of it. And Steve referred to structured data. So structured data would be something like a timestamp, a disposition status, an order, yes or no. Unstructured data might be something like a physician note. It might be like a radiology report. So all of that is in there, and historically we've had a lot more of an easier time working with these structured data elements, but a lot of the investment in EMDI has been to create more structure out of these unstructured data elements. And there's certainly still a lot of work to do, but I think that's where CDER and EMDI offer a lot of potential, because it has a lot of data that traditional administrative data sets don't have. So it will have vital signs, for example, repeat vital signs. It will have lab results, radiology results, not just orders, and it will have physician notes, nursing notes, reassessment notes, etc. It has social histories, for those places that collect it. But again, think about your average EHR, not everyone's on Epic. We have sites that, are on Cerner, sites that manually extract. There's a lot of heterogeneity. And a lot of the work that goes into curating the data is to standardize it into these 800 plus data elements across all sites to create meaning out of it. So a lot of advantages for doing clinical research in the future. And again, I alluded to this a little bit more, but what are the advantages of EMDI relative to existing data sets out there? First, it's almost real time. A lot of these sites are giving us quarterly feeds. So, when you think about other administrative data sources like Medicare, HCUP, there's often like a 2 to 3, maybe 4-year time lag. Volume, we're not extrapolating from a subsample. We get, for the most part, if a site participates, we get essentially their entire volume of cases. So, we're not doing any sampling. So we're talking, again, 20-ish million visits per year. And a lot of data that's clinically oriented that just isn't out there. And I think it really has the potential to accelerate a lot of clinical research, where now if you have a clinical research question, you have to build the infrastructure, enroll your sites, build the infrastructure for collecting and standardizing that data. And I think that the Emergency Metadata Institute is going to make that redundant because the infrastructure is already there. And so I think the future that we envision is one in which you have a clinical question, and we're already using CDER for real-time quality improvement. The vision is to be able to use the EMData Institute for real-time answering clinical research questions that are timely, and across a cohort of 900 plus EDs and a very diverse patient population. There's a lot of validation work that's going to have to get done in order to get us there, and that's an investment that we're actively talking about. But I think that's some of the really exciting potential that we have for the future. All right, I'm going to hand it off to Arjun Venkatesh.
All right. Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this turns into both practice and how this fits into the broader national landscape. And it'll build off of what Michelle was saying in terms of what type of data is in the Emergency Medicine Data Institute, and really get at some of those principles around quality that Steve raised. One of the networks that we've created over the past decade at ACEP is the Emergency Quality Network. This is now a network of over 1,000 EDs around the country engaged in quality improvement concurrently on big, high-impact areas in emergency care. Coming to this next year, we're going to have a national collaborative on caring for patients with opioid and alcohol use disorder, collaboratives on sepsis care, and collaboratives on care for people with PE and DVTs. And underlying these collaboratives is the collection of data and via metrics, really trying to identify what are the key practices that need to happen. Are they processes of care? What does it look like for anticoagulation for a PE? Did a sepsis bundle get implemented? In the case, was medication prescribed, buprenorphine or something like that for opioid use disorder? And we build these metrics, but really understanding and patterns of care, how they're implemented and whether or not they're happening at scale requires being able to plug them into bigger and broader initiatives. And so that's where the idea of the digital quality measure comes up. So EMDI can be a mega repository of a lot of EHR data from 25 million visits, 1,000 EDs around the country, but it's really, really messy. And we have to take that messiness of data and translate into something that can actually be used to drive improvements in care. And so a term that started getting used over the last so many years is a digital quality measure. What does that mean? It basically means our ability to assess quality of healthcare, what we're doing in the ED every day, based on digital data. It sounds sort of straightforward now, but this is a big shift in measurement and in quality. If I went back a decade ago, the way that we measured quality in emergency medicine was this. You would practice in the ED, take care of a stroke patient or take care of a patient with otitis externa, whatever it was, and your medical director would tell you, hey, at the bottom of your chart, make sure that you write these 2 sentences that said, I thought about whether or not this was an acute stroke and I did or did not give TPA, or I saw this patient with otitis externa and I did or did not prescribe them a topical antibiotic. And you literally had to write the sentence the way you were told to do it. And it's the exact kind of thing that burns emergency physicians out. It's bad data. It's people just being forced to document things. But the reason that was happening was that on the back end, the people who did the billing and coding for your group would manually look for those 2 sentences. And if they saw it, then they would put a code on the chart that says, check mark, quality met, and then that data would get sent on. That's not quality of care. That's just forced documentation. Fast forward to where we are today. We don't build quality measures like that at all anymore. The power of data and the power of electronic health records and the power of the connectivity of all these data across them is that we can let people practice. Let the workflow happen in whatever way it's going to happen, and then we try to glean on the back end how to turn those data into a digital quality measure. How do we look at whether or not somebody wrote an antibiotic and what that antibiotic was to know whether or not they were treating a patient with sepsis? How do we look at lab values to determine if that patient was in shock? How do we look at the admission order they were going to put in anyways when they admitted that patient to know whether the patient was admitted to the hospital, whether it was to the ICU or not, whether or not they needed CMO, where they were CMO? And so now we're taking all that data that's happening in the routine clinical practice and making it useful for quality measurement. So we have a better understanding of quality, and we're doing it in a way that doesn't burden and burn out physicians. The cutting edge of this starts to become, what are we doing with newer and newer data? It's one thing to do this to say, hey, did you prescribe buprenorphine for a patient with opioid use disorder? That's pretty structured and simple data. What we're starting to do within EMDI, though, is start implementing much more innovative data tools. And I'll use NLP, natural language processing, as the first example because I think it's a good one. NLP basically says, we're going to build a quantitative model, a mathematical model, that can look at free text and then determine the probability that it has some data you're looking for. Where we're using it right now is for pulmonary embolism. This world of NLP, machine learning, AI is moving so quickly that there's now open source code available that we can pull off a shelf that can look at any radiologist report, whether that radiology report was read in Alaska or Alabama, whether it was read within an Epic system, a Cerner system, a GE system, you name it. And it can look at the entirety of a radiology report interpretation from a radiologist and determine whether it was an acute PE, a chronic PE, a new diagnosis, a return diagnosis. And so now all of a sudden, we don't have to ask doctors to click this box or that box or even look for an ICD-10 code about PE. We're actually getting real clinical data out of the chart using NLP. And this is actually something that's already begun to be implemented in the CEDAR registry, where we've developed measures, we have figured out how to apply this NLP technology so that we can figure out whether or not a patient had a PE. What kind of measures does that make possible? We've got a measure that looks at the diagnostic yield of CT imaging studies done. So for all the CTs that are performed, how many come back with a positive PE study? What about diagnostic accuracy? Every time a PE is diagnosed, how many of those patients were in the ED in the prior 7 days with chief complaint or symptoms that could have been suggestive of a PE? It's kind of like a batting average for PE. These kinds of quality measures are going to drive care forward. They're going to demonstrate the best of emergency medicine, but they're only possible with these new technologies and the data. So where does this go in the future? Where's data going to take quality measurement in the future? The first, I think, is in patient-reported outcomes. A lot of what we measure right now is mortality. Did the patient live or die? Morbidity sometimes. Sometimes it's very process-oriented nature of care. Did we get a scan or not? Did we give the right medication or not? But often what we're doing for patients is improving their lives, improving their health status, improving what they would report as their quality of care. Think of the migraine headache patient. Right now, there's no quality measure that tells us whether we're doing a good or bad job with the migraine headache. But I do want to know, 24, 48, 72 hours after we treat a patient for acute migraine in the ED, are they feeling better? Are they back at work? Do they feel like they've got any more symptoms? And if the answer is yes to all that, we are starting to uncover the real quality of care. And that's where a lot of this data will go in the future. How do we link digital surveys from a patient to the ED visit after their discharge? Another area of data expansion is wearables. Many of you have seen TV commercials for the KardiaMobile. You hold this thing, it gives you an EKG reading. There's now a couple wearable devices that can detect whether a patient fell or had a stroke. We have to link that data back into our EHRs and our data systems in order to know whether or not the diagnosis of a stroke actually ended up on that patient that was wearing that wearable. There's millions of data points available on these devices, and we're going to be including those in how we think about the quality of emergency care. And then finally, artificial intelligence. Everybody's talking about it. There's probably a million different keynotes on AI here. It will work its way into this space. I actually envision a world where we see this happening at our shop already. We're quickly moving to ambient listening devices for essentially digital scribes. So you'll walk into the room, take care of a patient. You'll never go into the health records. You haven't document much of the note because the ambient scribe will have listened to the visit and put all the documentation in. You'll then walk back, do other things to take care of that patient. And on the back end, the billing and coding of that visit. Oh, sorry. There we go. On the back end, the billing and coding of that visit will also be done by an AI tool. We are literally about to live in a world where we can live our entire life at the bedside, assess the quality of care at the bedside, understand the outcomes that our patients are receiving, and almost never have to touch a computer. But we're going to have to build systems that can collect that size and messiness and fidelity of data, and then use AI tools to turn it into something that's usable for us to change practice.
Thank you. Well, I'll get the cleanup here for the group. Avi Mehrotra at the University of North Carolina and a member of the ACEP Board of Directors. So I wanted to talk real briefly about where we've used that data in real state now and what the utility of it is and kind of what the ideation could be for where we go with the potential of this. So we've got currently, you've heard about CEDAR within EMDI. Another potential that's developed and actually being utilized is the Hospitalist and Observation Medicine Registry. HOMER, as you can see there, serves as ACEP's response to the growing trend of physician groups that are offering multi-specialty professional services to their hospital partners. So the EMDI Board of Governors approved HOMER to pilot in 2024, and now it provides 7 additional CMS-approved QCDR measures that are aligned with the hospitalist and observation medicine practice. Hit the next slide, please. It's fine, just leave it. Just hit the next slide. Thank you. All right, one back. Thank you. Move all the way to the beginning. All right, that's fine. I'll just go keep going. So in 2023, the Board of Governors also approved a discovery and assessment based on antitrust concerns, looking at an economic registry. That's it. That's the one. And in 2024, we had an assessment by the ACEP lawyers to say, all right, how do we utilize this economic registry? Where can we get that data from? What are the guardrails around that? Had that in place, and that's approved to kind of give deference to that legal summary, but we've got the idea in place there. So the Board of Governors has approved developing a business plan for that economic registry. And then a small group of the advisors are working with ACEP staff to have some evaluation of what that business plan looks like. Just imagine the ability to use this sort of data to advance the conversation about the value of emergency care. Similar to going to be released in January, a RAND report looking at that with data around the billing and coding of both the visit from the professional side, but also from the facility side. So think about the potential of that, just demonstrate the value of emergency care. And then finally, so thinking the ideation side, this is the kind of the white space of where we could go with these ideas. So think about helping pharma companies evaluate for what the clinical trial protocol could be. Where are the patients that they're specifically looking for? The geographically, where are the patients that are coming in utilizing that drug, and then what are the appropriate inclusion or exclusion criteria that you can utilize to develop that drug. Extension of currently existing drugs, taking drugs that are off-label use and how's that being utilized, tying the use of a drug from diagnosis and being able to go from there. Think about medication adherence. Why are patients taking or not taking the medication that's prescribed to them? Is there a factor that happens with the time of day they're prescribed that? What their co-ingestions are with that? Are there interactions between drug or drug supplement that happen there? How do you utilize that from a safety perspective? And then finally, some really novel concepts out there. There's a company that's utilizing wellness data, specific markers within the record of the number of patients evaluated, et cetera, and predicting burnout amongst their physician staff. And so think about that from the potential of being able to act on that earlier for both the physician, the employer, and most importantly, the patients. With that, I think I did want to also mention that there is an AI survey that's, you'll find it at the tables. Please scan that. We're looking to integrate the AI task force. ACEP has an AI task force that's developed, and how the data within EMDI can be utilized for that. So please do complete that survey. Back to you. Yes.
So you have you've just heard a description of where the Emergency Medicine Data Institute has come. We're sitting now with about 100 million patient records and beginning to mine that data with the original construct that was developed by Steve Epstein. And our opportunity is to continue to improve that with validation and design of the emergency medicine appropriate tools that will continue to allow better use of our data. And what we want to know from you is what's important in your practice, and how could the Data Institute serve your needs across your career with your patient population. And rather than send this mic around because we're already having trouble with that, why don't you give me your questions, and I'd be glad to repeat them for the audience as they go across the YouTube universe. Questions for the panel? Panel members, I'll start with you, Steve. You have helped create the digital architecture of this. As you did that based on the practice that you have and a lot of other business interactions that you've had, let's put it that way, and your background in the AMA, knowing how important emergency medicine is to the AMA. What are the future structures that we're going to use that will allow us to fit our place into the house of medicine and what's important in the medical community?
So emergency medicine is somewhat unique in the medical community when it comes to this. We are way ahead of the curve compared to pretty much every other specialty, perhaps to the exception of anesthesia. But we were one of the very first registries to use end-to-end electronic data collection. So when you go back to oncology, tumor registries, trauma registries, cardiology, STEMI registries, all of those are manual. So if you're a trauma registry, if you're a level 1 trauma center, you have to have an actual human being who's designated as your trauma coordinator, who works in your hospital, whose sole job it is, well, not sole job, but one of their jobs is to take all of those trauma records and transcribe them and get the data back. We didn't take that approach. We went completely digital. And it's a huge advantage because when it comes to MIPS reporting, the vast majority of specialties created registries based on that old model. And a lot of them are office-based. So they would see their patients, they would have their paper or electronic chart, and somebody on the back end would then have to extract all of that. We took the more difficult task initially of collecting all of that data electronically. So from the clinician standpoint, It is absolutely seamless. There's no back end that anybody has to do in a group once we have this thing set up. It also means it's very easy for us, as you've heard, to create our quality measures tab and to collect all this data. That's not true for everybody. The House of Medicine thinks that NIPS is horrible. They want to get rid of it. And the AMA is actually working on proposals to somehow revise NIPS. And to some degree, I mean, it's not that NIPS is perfect. There are some problems with it. Just because we collect these quality measures, are we really affecting outcomes? Have we ever demonstrated that? And that says, I think, less about the program and more about the quality of the measures that we collect. Because a lot of what we've collected to this time are process measures. And it's really difficult to have good outcome measures. We have a few in CEDAR. I mean, I think the sepsis panel was kind of one of our first ones that's really demonstrated to be an outcome measure. But those are really tough. So we're going to have to see how the NIPS program evolves to make it easier for other clinicians. But as I said, we're ahead of the curve. So whatever they throw at us, we've got a pretty robust database, and I think it's going to stand the test of time.
Questions from the audience? All right, Michelle. Michelle's had the experience of going coast to coast in her emergency medicine practice from New York City, and she's now at Stanford. Stanford has experience with one of the largest and frankly most effective accountable care organizations on the planet, which is Kaiser. And having seen some of the practice, you have very valuable information that comes across the Kaiser system that feeds your emergency medicine practice that many of the rest of us don't. Tell us how that feels to practice in that environment.
That's a great question. I actually don't practice at Kaiser, although we do have a Kaiser affiliation. Our Kaiser faculty and our Stanford faculty are totally separate. We do see a lot of Kaiser patients, and it is interesting how much ownership they have over their patients, right? They repatriate their patients. So if they need to get admitted, even ops, we call them and we need permission because they would rather pay for that ambulance to pick up that patient and bring them back to their hospital than for them to stay at Stanford and get, outside care. They really take ownership. So there's a board-certified emergency physician on call 24/7, and their job is to talk to outside EDs about Kaiser patients who are thinking about admitting and transferring. And if it's truly something, emergent they can't do, of course, whatever cath lab, if their nearest Kaiser facility is not a trauma center, we do end up keeping those. But for the most part, they really take ownership, and they, are willing to put in the time and effort to have that 24/7 board certified EAD talk, coordinate that transfer. It's a single phone call for us, which really makes it seamless. Same number every time, so we don't have to think about it. And once they take care of the accepting doc, destination, etc. And so once we've had that conversation, it's sort of a done deal. I do think that they're certainly their care delivery and integrated payment model is one of a kind, and it's very unique.
Forgive me for not understanding your structure. When I was at Emory in Atlanta, we had a relatively small volume of Kaiser patients, and you wanted to see Kaiser patients because you had so much greater data on them, and you had so many more good options for patient disposition. And I spent time with Gus Carmel in your ED, and I didn't know there was a distinction between faculty. I apologize.
Yeah, but it's way easier to discharge them because you know that they're going to be able to get follow-up. And it's not like they have this, they have the same access to this 24/7 EPRP. So it's, again, there's a nurse that triages the calls before it gets to the level of an emergency physician. But if needed, that nurse can kick it up to in a board-certified ER doc. So their members have access to that same resource.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
I'll just say and it's good to see you, Jim. Kaiser has the data, and they've been doing this a long time, so they understand what they need to do to make it work. And they needed two things. They needed all the information, and they needed an ER doc. What other group do you talk to an ER doc when you're trying to figure out where they're going to go? And then you brainstorm, because they will do anything to repatriate. They will send a doc there to ride in the ambulance. They will wait for additional testing. They want their patients back in their facilities.
Thank you. All right. Measures, Stephen.
I worked before at Kaiser Fresno, and I don't like the idea over there because the cardiovascular surgeon, I was an AD over there, and the patient came in because of back pain, and it showed that he has 5C and aortic aneurysm, and I wanted to admit him, but the cardiovascular surgeon said no. So those are one of the pitfalls of Kaiser. Yeah, just because the patient is Kaiser insured, they just take it for granted. So I don't like it.
Yeah, it's definitely a very unique model. It's a unique model that works for the average patient, right? Because they have very, very well thought out clinical guidelines. And I think there are some patients where, that model of care is not ideal for them. But again, I do think it's an incredible model that combines both the EHR and the back end billing data, that we certainly can aspire to.
Anyone else? Arjun, you've spent your career training others in the development and use of measures. You now have the opportunity, and you've had the experience of taking measures and then watching them improve quality. Tell me how that ties together and how it will continue to work for us in emergency medicine practice.
Yeah, so to many people, quality measures can be a four-letter word in healthcare. I always joke as somebody who does quality measure development and implementation that thank God for the EHR. Had they not come by, then we would have been the boogeyman of healthcare. The reality, though, is you have to think of the counterfactual. Imagine a world. We've all practiced now with maybe one, probably even you're on your second or third EHR. Do you really want to practice without it? No, it was miserable. I had no information on any kind of patient. I was sure it seemed a little faster to check off on some T-sheet or something else, but we know from modern audit log data, we're really efficient at using the EHR. We get through it pretty quickly. We assemble a lot of data in it really fast, and we're able to do things, electronic referrals, automate processes, so many things that would have been impossible without it. Same is true in quality measurement. We and our group at Yale has spent a lot of time developing the readmission measures that are used in CMS programs around the country, the bane of many people's existence, they'll say. However, the question we always ask is this: would you really rather go back to a healthcare system where we didn't measure mortality at hospitals, or we didn't measure readmissions, and there was no investments made in improving these two things? I don't think so. The reality is that these kinds of changes are hard. They expose aspects to our care delivery system that show imperfections. And so in some ways, I always say that emergency medicine is well suited to this because we have the humility of practice. We've all made mistakes. We know we're going to miss things sometimes, that we are really good at saying, hey, there's problems around the system around us. Let's change our care, change our practice, use these measures to drive improvements. And we know they're working because we see these measures get topped out. Over the last decade, Michelle's been a key part of this and others here as well, we've developed numerous measures at ACEP that we've implemented in the registry, and then subsequently been told by CMS after 3, 4, or 5 years, this is topped out. Sometimes that's viewed like a negative, like something bad happened, that we don't have that measure anymore. It's a win. It means that performance nationally was average, and now it's so good you can't tell the difference between the best and worst ED in the country, and we don't need to measure it anymore. And there's a lot of examples of those kinds of wins in resource stewardship, in infection care, in stroke care, in so many different areas in what we do in emergency medicine. And we're so quick to move on to the next problem, the next quality measure that we have to worry about, just like you sort of run out of one patient's room and go into the next room, that you forget to sort of take a lap or take the victory for what we just accomplished with the prior measure.
Arjun, what happens when non-emergency medicine physicians or non-physicians write measures for emergency medicine?
A lot of good examples on this one. I'll pick a couple of my favorite historical ones. There is a quality measure that was really popular in the mid-2000s that said any patient that has pneumonia, community-acquired pneumonia, that's admitted to the hospital needs to receive antibiotics within 4 hours of ED arrival. And it was based on bad data. It was based on the administrative claims kind of data, not EHR data, a retrospective study that basically found, not surprisingly, people who got antibiotics earlier for pneumonia were more likely to survive than people who got it later. There's nothing magical at the third hour and 59th minute versus the 4th hour and 1 minute. You heard from the emergency medicine community this measure is terrible, but this was back at a time when CMS would actually develop the measures for doctors, and there was no registry, there was no ACEP developed measures, there was no emergency medicine-led measure development. So the measure went live, and what happened? After 4 years, everybody quickly got up to 100%, but meanwhile, about 30 to 40% of the antibiotics being prescribed for pneumonia were for patients who had no pneumonia at all. You'd have patients who came with an altered mental status getting pneumonia. You'd have patients who just came in with a cough getting antibiotics. And so we had created this massive antibiotic stewardship problem, probably contributed to the antibiotic resistance problems we had seen today. And on balance, net quality was worse. And what did? We alienated emergency physicians for the next decade from quality measurement because everybody had such a bad taste in their mouth from that first measure. And so what we now see is a world where when we develop these measures, they're clinically grounded, they've got exclusions that make sense. We think about things like presenting symptoms and chief complaints, not just diagnoses at the end of the visit. We think about what outcome does matter, which one doesn't matter. What is low-risk chest pain? Really hard to define that if you've never worked in the ED, but really easy to mess that up if you haven't worked in the ED. And so that's where that sort of clinically grounded use of the data becomes really important in measure development.
Can you tell us about OB complications in the Medicare patient population?
It's another good example. In Michelle's slide, she mentioned the all-payer issue. It's a big thing. One of the things that's really hard about emergency medicine is we may take care of 150 million people a year, but amongst that 150 million people a year, they're cut in so many different strata. Some people are insured by Medicare, some by Medicaid, some uninsured. Some people are older adults, some are average age adults, some are children. Some people have chest pain, some people have abdominal pain. And so what ends up happening is even with the 30 to 40 quality measures we have right now, we're probably only measuring quality on 10 to 20% of the people who walk in the front door of the ED. It was even worse historically. The example Jim gives is when we started with measure development, every measure, because it was being used to determine how much CMS or Medicare would pay, would only include Medicare patients. And so what happened, we developed a measure around whether or not we did an HCG on patients that have abdominal pain or whether we gave Rogaine for an RH-negative pregnant woman, limited to those who were receiving fee-for-service coverage from Medicare. Sure enough, all 6 patients in the country that met that criteria every year might have got great quality of care, but nothing, the dial was not moved. And so one of the things that happens as you move towards these electronic registries, start aggregating and collecting data in an all-payer format, it totally changes what the populations look like. We now have quality measures when you look in the registry where for a given ED, they won't have 10 cases, they'll have 100 cases, 1,000 cases. You know, one of the most used measures in the country is around ED throughput of patients. That includes almost every ED visit. So if there's 20 million visits in that registry every year, all 20 million of those patients had the quality of their care improved and impacted and touched by the quality measures that we have today. And so we continue to try to get at this problem. It's a real big problem. Like I said, we're probably only at 10 or 20% of the visits we see. Do I think we can get to 100? Probably not. We're in the business of seeing zebras and rare things and emerging things we've never thought about. But if we can get to 30, 40, 50% of the patients who come to our EDs getting higher quality of care because they're included in the quality measure versus where it used to be a decade ago, which is probably about 1 or 2%, that's a huge win.
Anything from the audience?
Hello, you guys are in California, which is like its own no man's land. But you guys have different privacy laws than other states, like other consumer protections that aren't necessarily in other states. If you're crossing state lines, are there barriers to getting that data? Do you run into like legislative hurdles, like we don't want our patient data collected in Wyoming because that's their private data. We don't want it as part of this national data system. Is there any of that?
So fortunately, we don't run into that. The data that we collect is de-identified. I mean, the whole thing is secured. All the data is secured, both in rest and while in motion. It's all de-identified. We do not store it at ACEP. It's in secure cloud format. So we take an awful lot of protections. We also have business associate agreements with all of the hospitals that participate. And that deals with kind of the legal issues, HIPAA issues in terms of transmission of data and the like. So we've taken extraordinary care when it comes to the data, and for good reason, obviously. But the good news there, just in terms of let's say God forbid there were a breach, all the data is de-identified. To the point where it's hard to even tell geographically with some of them right now where those patients are located. And we're pretty careful to, even when we release data, to make sure that we only provide that amount necessary for the research question that's being answered. So if you have a very specific question, you're going to get a very small data set because you're not going to want to be able to identify anyone. Whereas if you have a more general one, you can provide some data because of the instances. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for bringing that up. And that my earlier example of the weather and the data streams that feed weather forecasts. At some point, you're interested in local weather. At some points, in regional weather. At some points, in national weather. For our friends from Carolina, hurricanes happen only in Florida and Texas, right? The Gulf Coast. They were clobbered. Lives were saved in North Carolina because the regional forecast for Florida turns into a life threat in North Carolina. We have those same opportunities with our data. Obviously, there are events that happen in Wyoming that don't happen in California and vice versa. And we have to be able to parse our data so that we give people answers wherever their practice location is. Anything else? Avi, you're a board of director member of ACEP. We're in a wonderful meeting here. There's a lot of priorities before the board. Where does the EMBI fit into the future of the American Council of Sleep Physicians?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, I think as you heard, the different components of EMBI, first and foremost is CEDAR, Clinical Emergency Data Registry, to be able to submit the MIPS performance for our members, right? That's one of the reason it was created, why we had the quality measures in the first place. But those quality measures aren't perfect, as was noted by our panelists. Those quality measures are for checking the box. We want to get to the point where we're doing true quality assessment, closing a gap where those care delivery of those 150 million patients that are coming to our emergency departments. And so that's the next step, where we go from just submitting what the measurement is for the reimbursement purpose versus actually trying to close a gap of care. And so that's the next step that we have to go with for our members and for our patients.
All right. Any final words from the group? Steve? Closing comments? All right. Michelle? Arjun? All right. We thank you all for being here, and we have several days of events outlined in the HACT schedule. We thank all of you for your interest in improving the future of our specialty and our practice and the care of 160 million patients a year. Let's keep it moving forward. Thank you all. You're done. Michelle, thanks.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that distinction.
Oh, don't worry
I'm
about
sorry.
it. Oh, it's okay.
I was out there with Gus Armel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, he works at Kaiser. Yes, he's never
Go back to the first slide.
Yeah.
And I want a picture of our panelists.
Of course, the residents were together.
We can use this side.
Same.
Huh? No, that's fine.
Um,
Hey, do I,